Bonsoir tout le monde, ça va bien? We're in winter mode. C'est l'hiver. Il fait froid. Everybody's at the doudoune, as we call the duvet coat. Vous avez beaucoup de doudoune. My name is Emilia Belge, and I am very happy to welcome you tonight. Thank you for being with us as we start a second program in our series in partnership with the Chicago Architecture Biennale. As you might know, this is the only architecture biennale in the world besides Venice. So we're very proud to be part of it, along with our partners. So let me thank our partners before I forget, because sometimes that's not good. The programs we do are possible in part thanks to the Jean Budfish Memorial Fund and the essential support of our partners, Villa Albertine, City, the French Consulate in Chicago, and the Dries Museum. But tonight, what are we doing? Tonight we are integrating nature and cities, or at least we're going to discuss it and see how it can happen faster, probably. And with us to discuss this, we will have Marion Waller, who's the director of the Pavillon de l'Arsenal, the Paris Center for Architecture and Urbanism. And it's located, anybody been there before? Pavillon de l'Arsenal? Ah, nous avons quelques Français. It's a destination we don't always know about, but I'm so curious to go. It's in the 4e arrondissement. I'll even tell you the street if you're interested, on 21 Boulevard Morland. Marion Waller is the director of the Pavillon de l'Arsenal in Paris, but she's also an urbanist and the author of Natural Artifacts. Before we get started, just a few announcements. We have more architecture coming up to the Alliance. The next one is the Symposium on Contemporary French Architecture, which is a series of 3 talks or events that we call fundraising in terms of it's benefiting the cultural and educational program here at the Alliance. The first one is next Thursday, October 19, when we welcome the partner and director of strategy at the global architecture firm NVRDV. His name is Jan Nicker. He will talk about sustainable and social architecture and urbanism in France. And on Saturday, October 21st, we present a forum of ideas on Hector Guimard, the French Art Nouveau architect. If you went to Paris, you take the subway, the metro, and you probably know some of the famous entrances that look like Art Nouveau. We're actually trying to get one here at the city stop of the Chicago Avenue Red Line, so we'll see how that goes. So this program is in partnership with the Trio Museum. It's a companion program to their ongoing exhibition at the museum. Nous les remercions, and now to tell you more about tonight's program, I would like to welcome Nicolas Doué from Villa Albertine. Merci.
Thank you, Aimé. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Alliance Française, a unique place dedicated to the promotion of French culture and language in Chicago for 126 years. First of all, I'd like to extend my warmest thanks to Marie-Hélène Connelan, Maya Rouleau, and Emilia Berge for welcoming us this evening and for their enthusiasm and confidence over so many years of collaboration. I'm Nicolas Doué. I'm the education attaché at the French Consulate and also the deputy director of the Villa Albertine in Chicago. For those who don't know us yet, Villa Albertine has been launched by the French Cultural Services in the United States 2 years ago to support the cultural dialogue between our 2 countries. Tonight is our second event in partnership with the Alliance Française, as part of the 5th Chicago Architecture Biennial, and there will be many more. Take a look at our brochure. I think you will be able to find it outside. And also you can look at the Villa Albertine's website. So tonight we welcome 2 incredible city makers and thinkers who just published 2 fascinating books about nature and cities. Marion Waller is a curator and urbanist, so formerly advising the mayor of Paris on urban planning, architecture, and green space. She studied philosophy at the Ecole Normale Supérieure de Paris and urban affairs at Sciences Po Paris. She's the director of the Pavillon de l'Arsenal, so the bigger play center dedicated to exhibition and debate about architecture and planning in Paris. And also welcome online Andrew Todd, who couldn't make it to the US due to an unfortunate event. So Andrew Todd is an architect, winner of the WAN Award for the best wooden building in the world for the Hardelot Elizabethan Theatre. And in his book, he takes us on a journey which looks at trees and forests from different viewpoints, as solid matter for building shelter, as ongoing habitat for timeless tribes, as the seat of Western origin myths. So The Clearing, the title of the book, takes us to the contested multi-layered forest of old and New England, to the tropical rainforest, to ultra-modern Japan, to harmonious and innovative wooden villages in Austria, and to the Ascension Island in the middle of the Atlantic. So before the conversation with Marion Waller, we will start with a short video sent by Andrew Todd. Thank you.
Bonsoir, bonsoir Marion, bonsoir Axel et Nicolas, and thank you very much to the Alliance Française and the Institut Français of Chicago for organizing this wonderful event, at which obviously very sadly I'm not physically present for circumstances that I will elaborate in due course. I am Andrew Todd, so I'm the author of this book, The Clearing, How We Live and Die the Trees, which is being presented in parallel with the wonderful book Natural Artifacts by Marion Waller, who you will be lucky to hear from in person. You'll be able to also meet the books if you can't meet me. And I'm going to just spend a few minutes here in my absence to explain what this book is about. I think it relates very closely to Marion's book in a complementary way. They're using very, very different tools, but they're talking about many of the same subjects. And I actually had the privilege to translate Marion's book into English, so there's a sort of interweaving going on here between different subjects, different people. The starting point and the protagonist for my book is my relationship with my father, Peter Todd, and his professional project in life was in fact taking care of trees and forests. He was also a very gifted painter and a landscape designer, but what he did professionally was to sort of mitigate negative effects and plan in a very, very long-term way on very large sites and landscapes and ecosystems, which is actually something a large part of what Marion's book is about. It's another way that these books talk to each other. Now, my father died in 2018, and the book begins with the story of one tree, and it ends with the story of another tree. And these trees are now neighbours, and the tree at the beginning relates to my childhood. It's a bonsai, a Japanese tree, a Pinus parviflora, which is 3 years older than me, biologically, which my father and I adopted and started to care for and sort of stalk and bend to our will and to our aims when I was 11 years old. And I inherited this tree on my father's death. So going from sort of close up to a longer view, there are a series of chapters in the book which try to undertake rereadings of received notions of Western art history and mythology, and ways we have of having a sort of accepted story about how we relate to the world. Cut to the chase, I'm talking about the first verses of Genesis here, which with the notion of the dominion over God's creation by man, it can be read as justification and it is used as justification by political figures and economic figures, for clear-cutting Amazonian forest, because who cares about the pagans and the trees there. That's practically a direct quote from the former Brazilian President Jair Bolsonaro. So by looking again at the beginning of Genesis, particularly Genesis 2, which is probably the original text where things are not quite as simple as we might think. In fact, whilst God is sleeping, rain falls on the earth. In other words, he didn't will it. And it's from this rain and its interaction with the ground and the creation of clay that he forms Adam. So there's a different kind of agency at work there. And then likewise with the sort of origin myths of architecture, so Vitruvius, a Roman engineer writing contemporaneously to Christ actually, we have tended to only look at, his sort of Vitruvian man with arms outstretched as drawn by Leonardo da Vinci as being at the centre of things and the founder of all proportions. So whereas if you read his text about the origins of architecture, as I tried to do in this book, with a different viewpoint, perhaps a sort of side view, you understand very quickly that there's not such a clear distinction in his mind between humans and animals, and between animals and humans and the vegetable world. So it's a sort of animist rereading of Vitruvius, and this carries on through various sort of levels of reading of particularly Renaissance theory, which obviously placed the human and particularly the man at the centre of ideology and ideas and proportions and all these kinds of things. Now, I'm trying throughout the book to sort of resonate between the small and the personal and big ideas, and also certain other figures that I've been relating to. But I also try to open it up to other cultures and their attitudes towards the forest and to wood. So there's an aspect of sort of comparative anthropology there. Because it turns out, I think we have an awful lot to learn from people who are different to ourselves. And in this case, I went to sort of unfamiliar places I've become familiar with, such as Japan and Western Austria, and a place that I don't actually know, but that I've studied a great deal, which is Central Africa, and also Amazonia, where there are still plenty of people who live very, very harmoniously with the forest. If we start there with the Mbuti pygmies in Central Africa and DRC now, there's another aspect to that which relates to how we live in cities, which is redefining what we mean by live well. So it's not in the case of that part of the world over the top consumption of resources and prosperity. There is a very, very serious and very wonderful frugality about the way buildings are made, quite simply in many cases, or certainly geometrically quite simple, but with a great deal of ingenuity in terms of optimizing resources, and also in creating an extremely positive context for life, because they don't just use wood as a structural material that gets boarded up. They find ingenious ways to continue inhabiting it within architectural structures. So we live in an age of absolutely terrible destruction and crisis. But it is at the same time an age of wonder and discovery if we use the impetus of our responsibilities to open ourselves up another way. And my hope is that if you take this book with you, it may, through some of the stories that are told in it, open up a few keys towards looking at things in different ways, and spread in a general, not in a linear way, the awareness that we all need in order to cope with the challenges of life as it is today. Thank you very much. Merci beaucoup.
Thank you, Marion. So before talking directly about your book, do you have any reaction to Andrew Todd's talk? And also, Andrew is very interested in history, so maybe later we could talk about it.
Okay. Thank you for the invitation. I'm very happy to be here. And before talking about Andrew, just to say that also for me it's an honor to talk about those topics here in the US, because when I started studying ecological restoration, which was at the heart of my book, this topic didn't really exist in Europe and among European philosophers. So when I researched, it was essentially American texts and about ecological restoration that was made in the US, because this practice also started a lot in the US, and a lot of texts about wildness. So yeah, being in the US is it's very nice. And so, as Andrew said in the video, I think our works are quite linked for many reasons, and I think because we try to see differently what we imagine as nature and what we imagine as our action is in nature. And obviously, like, he's an architect and I'm an urban planner and also philosopher, and like we are interested in how we can still create in this time of environmental crisis. Like, how can we still interact with the environment? Because I think that now, like, we have several options facing the environmental crisis. One option would be like waiting for collapse, being anxious, which we are all also, but I think that we have to look for a transformation in nature, and I think Andrew also, and like always looking for ways of interacting differently with the environment and not only despair.
Great. So Andrew is very interested in trees, so I don't know if you see them as natural artifacts, and especially when they are in the city and are the focus of a lot of political attention. And I'm thinking of Paris, for example. Maybe trees are natural artifacts in the way they've come to play an important role in the recent urban policies. So I'm thinking of the call for the greening policies made directly by citizens, also of the transformation of the school playground with the cool oasis, also with the projects of the urban forest near the Hôtel de Ville or the Opera or the Gare de Lyon.
So when I began my research, it was more about like so-called natural environments which were damaged, so like forests or lakes that had to be restored because something happened, a fire or something else. And so I wrote my book about those spaces, thinking about how we can like heal nature and how this can inspire us as a view on ecology. But right now, referring to your question, actually I think that we should have the same approach to cities, meaning that cities, like, we have to heal cities, we have to restore cities, because the way they were like planned is simply not adapted for the environmental crisis and for a good quality of life, and that's why we have to bring a lot more nature into cities, and by all means. I think that because sometimes people oppose, like some people say, yeah, we need only big parks, that is not enough, etc. I think we need like all ways of integrating nature in the city, and we have to be very innovative. And so I worked 8 years at the city hall, and in Paris, since the city is very small and very dense, it's one of the densest cities in the world. Like, we cannot create new parks like that, you know, we don't have space, so we had to be very innovative. So for example, what we did was like transforming the schoolyards, so it's called Cour Oasis, transforming the schoolyards that are essentially mineral into gardens. And when you do that, you can create gardens everywhere in the city. You can create also gardens that can be open during weekends and during holidays, also for people who don't go on holidays. So that's very important. So it's really looking at every space differently. Like, a schoolyard can be something else. A street, like a classical Parisian street, the image we have of it is like cars in the middle, sidewalks, and a few trees. And right now, what is happening in Paris, especially in front of schools, it's called like streets for children is that the nature and children are put at the center of the street and not cars anymore. And when you say that, it completely changes the image you have of a street, and so you can have a garden street basically. And there is also this idea of having forests at the heart of the city, which is of course quite new for the Parisian context, because we used to think that Paris is a mineral city, and so the mayor decided to create some urban forests, and I think it's an interesting typology to look for, because it's this idea of having very dense natural areas inside the city, and so that we need density also in terms of nature, not only in terms of architecture.
Great. So can we maybe go back to the main definition of your book about the natural artifacts? So what remains of nature in the contemporary city? And should we be looking at parks, or rather at how to manage risk like flooding, or so? How do you define?
So I think the idea behind natural artifacts is the fact that we can create like hybrid entities that can actually belong to nature. The starting point is the fact that when we create something, we usually say that it's not part of nature, like it's human-made, so it's artificial. But what I studied is like when you look, when you think about what is creating, you actually realize that animals also create habitats. If you take a forest, you have some habitats created by animals, but you also have like infrastructures created by animals, like sometimes they can create a thing to pass a river or things like that. So the fact of creating like a habitat or infrastructure is not only human, I think. And so when you realize that, it means that there is a way also for human beings to create things that can be integrated into nature. And for me that's very important, because I think we need hope, and we need to know that our intervention in nature is not only for bad things, you know. If we think that every time we do something with natural entities we are damaging nature, I think there is no way for ecology. So that's why I prefer to think differently and say, okay, is there a way for like acting in nature and healing nature and having an ethical action into nature? And that's why I started by ecological restoration, which is an extreme case, because when nature is damaged, like in a way you are obliged to intervene, and it poses a lot of questions, and there have been a lot of parallels made between ecological restoration and medicine, because you are acting in vulnerability, like you are healing somebody or an ecosystem that is very vulnerable, and so you have to be very ethical in your choices, and how do you deal with this vulnerability. And that's why a lot of philosophers actually researched on that topic, on ecological restoration, because they were asking like, okay, is it fake nature when we recreate nature? Like how much are we allowed to recreate nature? And when we do ecological restoration, is it not like a way to justify, of course, damaging nature? Because if you are allowed every time to recreate, you can after say like, yeah, I will just damage and recreate. So there are some very strong ethical questions, but I think it's the type of questions that we will have every day in our lives, and in cities or in natural parks, because we are in a damaged environment globally, and that's why also it's interesting in the US context, because there were all those debates about wilderness, and right now we know that there is no place on Earth that is not affected climatically, you know. So even if it's like a wild area, there is a climate impact. So in a way, all ecosystems are damaged. So how do we deal with that, and what are our common principles to intervene there?
Great. Can you give us some example on a larger scale in the US or in France or maybe in Paris to see how we can use this concept in a practical way. I mean, here in Chicago we have a river that's been reversed, so maybe it could be an example. But I don't know if you have some other from Paris, maybe.
So one of the founding persons of ecological restoration is Hardelot Elizabethan, an American writer, and he used to do ecological restoration in his garden. So I want to insist on that also, on the fact that the beginning of this practice was very community-based and quite simple. And I think also it's so ecological restoration can be a bit like a gardener action for anyone in his or her garden. But then there is this larger scale. So of course in cities like rivers, for example in Paris, there is a river called La Bièvre. La Bièvre, so it was a river that posed a lot of problems because there were like hygiene problems. So it was entirely covered. And right now, there is this question in Paris, like, should we reopen it? But it's not easy, of course, because like on some parts in the suburbs, it has been already reopened. But if you reopen in Paris, you have people living on the side. So what does it mean, like reopening a river now? And that's why you have to accept design, you have to accept creation, because it will never be like before, you know, like you can't have Paris like before, and that's one of the big topics about ecological restoration. Also, what is your point of reference that you are reaching? Like, do you want nature to be like 100 years ago or 1,000 years ago? And I know there were all those debates in the US. Like what is our reference point? And I think we have to accept that the goal of ecological restoration is not going back to the past, is like accepting also a contemporary action on nature and a new way of interacting, because copying the past is often not, it doesn't work.
Yeah, I mean, we can obviously see it as a kind of summary of the history of urban and regional planning, but if we look at the major debates in face of climate change, can we see those natural artifacts at the opposition of the smart city maybe, and as another way to answer the techno-solutionism?
Yeah, it's true that there has been this moment in urban planning, I would say more like maybe 5-10 years ago, where everybody was talking only about smart city. So this idea that you could, through technology, you could like solution any problems in cities. And I remember there were those videos in the past where ads by IBM, for example, where you had this building, like command building, and they say, okay, you can manage your city. Like you have
dashboard.
Yeah, a dashboard, and you just manage everything, you know. And so some cities try that, and I think now everybody is like also moving forward. And I think that right now it's more this moment of like nature in cities, meaning that we need a city adaptation just to survive. Like for example, in Paris right now, we have like heat waves like everywhere. But I think people are really realizing that if we don't transform the city, like we won't survive because it's simply too hot. And so saying that Paris is a mineral city is a direct threat now to our survival in the city. Like we need trees everywhere, we need plants, because if not, it will simply be too hot. We will have the climate of Napoli in Paris. So it's not. So that's why also there is a big shift, because before nature sometimes was seen more as an ornament, like a plus, but right now it's completely vital. And I think it was a mistake in urban planning to put nature aside and to do zoning at large scale, like to say, okay, we have natural parks on the one side and we have cities on the other side. And that's one of the problems with wilderness, is the fact of saying, okay, there are some areas for wilderness, and like, what about the rest? you know, and so I think we have to accept that cities are not exclusively for humans, and that cities can look completely differently. Like if you really think nature at the heart of cities, vegetables and also more animals, then the streets can look different, the plazas can look different. Like the image we have of cities can be completely different. And I'm convinced that we are only at the beginning of that movement in like contemporary urban planning, and that if imagination is released, we can do really amazing things.
You just mentioned the animals in the city,
Yeah.
and I think that you just closed an exhibition about Paris and animal.
Yeah.
Can you maybe share a few things about it?
Yeah, you know what is interesting with animals is that, of course, they are always in the city, but it's what we showed in this exhibition is that depending on the time period, we want to see them or not. So, for example, in Paris, there are always those debates about rats, but I think in other cities also. And so depending on the period, like there are some times where animals are just identified to something not clean, and right now there is this new period where we have to find ways to cohabit, and that's what we showed in the exhibition. Is okay, how do we do if we want more animals, because obviously if we want more nature, we will have more animals also. What does it mean? It means that you have to change the soil of the city, because if okay, you have parks, you have some trees, but if you want animals to be able to go from one park to another, to really move in the city, like we need really living soils, and so that means a different approach to urban planning and to architecture, having living soils. And we are also launching a lot of research on that at the Pavillon L'Arsenal. And here also I think it's only the beginning, because obviously the way we did public space in Paris or elsewhere, it was not about having living soil, like it was not the priority. And of course cities are always about conflicts of uses, because you have so many different things to integrate, and if now you add animals, it's very complicated, because already you have the bikes, you have the cars, the people, it's a mess, and you add animals. Okay, good luck. But that's
Talking about these interactions, in your book you use the concept of boundaries object. Can you maybe go back to it and say a few things about, is it like on a political side or on a natural side?
so I think we have to accept and to create like hybrid entities, and the French philosopher Bruno Latour, who died recently, talked a lot about hybridity, meaning that in this moment of like where technique and technology is very present, like we create a lot of things that are not completely nature, not completely artificial, and that we have to integrate them, to name them and to integrate them in a way into democracy. And so I think we have to accept that, as I said at the beginning, that we are creating, for example, urban forests. Some people say, oh, it's ridiculous, like urban forest, what does it mean? Okay, but why not? You know, like why not inventing also a new typology? It has to have an ecological sense, of course. It's not just for fun, but I think we have to accept that there will be those new typologies, and that we have to give them space. And sorry, just to go back on animals, it's also all the question of domestic animals. You know, it's and there are also a lot of philosophers writing about it, because like domestic animals, it's a completely different category. Like, you know, it's a bit part of the family. So and the way you interact with them, it's also a hybrid domestic animal. You know, so there are all those new categories that we have to deal with.
Great. Maybe let's go back to the soil, because the city of Paris just presented a new urban plan dedicated to bioclimatic issues. So do you see a link between this new plan and your book?
Yeah, so the idea of this new plan, it's about bioclimatic architecture. And I think it's quite new to to have a plan that really focuses on that, because usually urban plans are really about like zoning and like rules about height and okay, so you say okay, in this area you can have offices and private housing and your building has to be tall like that and blah blah. But with this new plan, the bioclimatic urban plan, the focus is really on nature and on how every building has to adapt also to climate and to and that architecture, you know, shouldn't be something standard. Like you have to adapt, of course, to the light and all that. And it's very hard to mix like regulatory urban planning with that. And I think it's very important. And there are new rules, of course, about also protecting trees, which were not so much protected before, and about how when you have like empty space in the middle of a parcel, how you protect it. So it's a complete change of view on the city, where you don't start by like building, but you start also by empty space and how you can protect all that.
Yeah, and it reminds me of a very beautiful exhibition 1 year ago about transformation, adaptation of the building and architecture. Maybe you can.
Yeah. Yeah, and yeah, right now in Paris also the focus is really on transformation and not new buildings, which is very important because we still have this idea sometimes that like creation in architecture is new buildings, but in Paris we try to prove every day that actually transformation is as interesting and even more interesting, and that in most cases we can transform building. We shouldn't demolish every time, because there are all types of patrimony, even if it's like not the famous patrimony, it's a form of patrimony because people live there, because there is a history, and because it's a lot of materials, you know. If you demolish a building, you build something new, it's just so much materials you are removing, and that's why we have had this shift right now in Paris. And now it's really a priority, like you have to really prove that it's impossible to keep a building if you want to demolish it.
One of the good examples was the transformation of the old Préfecture de Paris near the Pavillon de l'Arsenal, and I think that when you were the advisor of the Deputy Mayor of Paris dedicated to urban planning, you've worked a lot on the Réinventer Paris, so the competition for architects.
Yeah.
Can you say a few things about it?
Yeah, so we organized a competition called Réinventer Paris, where we chose 23 buildings or spaces in Paris, and we asked architects, designers to transform those spaces. And so, for example, we had this office building, which is just besides my office, a huge office building where there were only offices, and the public couldn't go while there is really a beautiful view on the Seine River. And the project that is now finished, there are 12 different uses in that same building, so from 1 use to 12 uses. And for us, it's really a proof about how we can transform. Because inside you have like social housing, and we have quite strict rules in Paris. We are lucky to have quite strict rules to have more mixity in all parts of the city. If you do private housing, you are obliged to do social housing in the same building. And so in that building there is social housing, private housing, hostel, luxury hotel, 3 restaurants, garden, and we wanted to prove that with any building you can actually create this mixity. And also in this room there is the architect who is transforming the Tour Montparnasse, so I'm saying can you raise your hand so if people want to talk to him also at the end. So you may know the Tour Montparnasse, which is a building, a tower in the center of Paris that people used to hate, like they found it too dark and not beautiful. And so the project that won is really amazing because it transforms this building also by bringing more mixity inside the tower and creating, also adding more nature into that building and creating more links with the public space. And so for us it was important to show that even with this building that people didn't really like, actually we can of course keep it and not by changing everything, but by changing important things, we can completely transform the image we have of it. So that's why we are trying to, that's, yeah, what we are trying to prove.
Definitely, we cannot wait to see the new Tour Montparnasse. So Marion, you've been running the Pavillon de l'Arsenal for a few months now. Can you tell us a little bit more about this place and its program? And what's the difference between being a philosopher and not only an urban planner to run a place like this?
So yeah, if you come to Paris, you have to come to Pavillon de l'Arsenal. It's the center for architecture and urban planning in the center of Paris, and we have exhibitions all year long about Paris and architecture, and we always try to share a new image of Paris. For example, this exhibition we had about animals, it was, so we revisited the history of Paris through animals, and so, because we, of course, we all have images of Paris, but we try to show, different angles, and so we also host a lot of events, and what I try to do there is really to think about what are the fundamentals of a city, because I think right now there is this question of survival in cities, and in Paris we feel it, and so we need to remind, like, okay, why do we live in cities? Like, why were cities invented in the first place? Because a city is never by chance in a certain place, and so through all the coming exhibitions, what we will do is like look at fundamental elements of cities, of Paris, and think about how we can transform those elements. So we will talk about what is education in cities, because of course you go to cities often to get some better education. What is storage, because cities in the beginning were also invented to like store food and goods, so we will think about what does it mean today. We will talk about also the sacred, like because we what is sacred now in a city. We'll talk about soils, so that will be all our exhibition, but really thinking about, why do we still live in cities, and how we can reinvent this beautiful idea.
And being a philosopher to run a place like this?
Yeah, so that's a bit the link with your question is, I think, going to like fundamental questions and always having a like interdisciplinary approach to questions, but not only looking at like the architectural solutions, but always asking the question like, why are we here? You know, what is the purpose of this space? So I think that's a way to approach cities, which is both urban planning and philosophy.
I think we might have some time for questions, maybe about Paris, restoration, next Olympics.
Okay, just we will welcome the question. Thank you so much. This was fascinating. There's so many things I think Chicago could listen to in this. I just want to say, please use the microphone for your question because we are recording the event. And now, yes, to anybody with questions. Monsieur, vous êtes très proche.
I have several questions, but I'll ask two, if I may. You said earlier, when you talked about this river in Paris that I've never heard of, I only knew about the Seine, that nature cannot be restored back to, 1,000 years ago. So could you elaborate on that? Why not? And also, the other question is there a big city somewhere around the world where you think they're doing the right thing in terms of incorporating nature into the urban setting? Thanks.
So for the river, the thing is like there were really like hygiene problems, and so people were like throwing things into the river. And if you recreate the river now, it means that some people going out of their house or apartment would be in water. So that's why it's like but I mean, why not? But it's for like access to houses and how the city evolved since that time, and for like accessibility and all that, it creates a lot of problems.
So you were referring to that specific case, or
Yeah.
you made a general statement?
No, about that
Okay.
that river. So that's why I think in this very dense context, you have to find something new, like with some water, but maybe not like Venice. Like, but it can be even. And so your second question, of course, it depends a lot on what is your. Because I mean, urban models are so different that obviously you cannot apply the same to. But I think that Paris is doing quite well. I think because Paris is really small and dense, as I said. So I believe that what we can achieve in Paris can also be achieved in many cities. Because it's so hard, but it requires a lot of courage, because of course it means like there is no free space, so if you add some nature you had to remove some space to others, and in Paris the choice that was made was removing some space to cars, which of course is very hard politically. So that's the thing, like in urban planning you have to make choices. And so yeah, then Milan also is doing, I think, a lot of great things on public space. And then there are some cities, like in Paris we also really needed nature because we don't have like very large landscape. You know, when I arrived to Chicago, it was my first time, I was like, wow, you have a lake, you know, that's crazy, like having this view. So that's also why in Paris we need so much like new forms of nature, because we don't have like this huge lake or something like that. So some cities, I think, have this advantage of having a better link to a larger landscape, being mountains or lakes. So it's different.
Thank you.
Hello, that was such a wonderful conversation.
Thank you.
So I feel very inspired. I had a couple questions, but I'll try and keep it brief. When you say living soil, what does that mean exactly? And then, you know, in the American context, you have a lot of private and public relationships, and how does that look like in the Paris or French context of like, you know, maybe more market-related solutions or players who are involved in the conversation. And then another question would be just the tolerance of also urban infrastructure to nature. Because, for example, last week in front of my house, Chicago has a lot of tree-lined streets, and trees as they age, they might have branches falling, they might puncture water pipes. So like, what are some of the ideas around, you know, the creating maybe more harmonious relationships between nature and human infrastructure?
So about soil, as I said, I think it's still an emerging research field, but the most important idea is that in cities we were living in a kind of monoculture of the soil and of buildings. Like soil had to be only, how do you say, bitumen?
Concrete.
Yeah, like basically concrete. Like both soils and buildings were only in concrete. And that was the idea we had of like, okay, what is a city soil? You know, it's concrete. And what is a building in city? It's concrete. And so now the shift is like moving out this monoculture and saying, okay, no, it can be something else. So the first thing is for also heat reasons. Right now we are testing in Paris a clearer soil because it reflects less the heat. That's the first thing. But to have really a living soil, it means having different proportion on, like, if you have a city with concrete and some trees, you know, sometimes around the trees you have like living soil. And so it's like changing the proportion and thinking, okay, what if we extend this space around trees, and we make it like very long and large spaces, and if concrete was only very a small part of it, you know. So I think, yeah, that's the change, and so it requires, of course, a lot of changes also in private spaces, as you said, and imagining new continuities between gardens, public space, private, public. It's a new urban plan that has to be made everywhere, because urban plans were not really about that. So maybe like urban plans could be like by starting by those like natural continuities, and then say, okay, where can we build, but not starting by, okay, where can we build, you know. So I think if we say soil is a priority, it really changes the way we do zoning and the way where we allow to build or not to build. But it's really a revolution in urban planning. And then about infrastructures, it's very complex. As I said, like also city is about complexity. Like every time, and that's a threat I saw in Paris, is that sometimes since we are protecting more and more things and trees and all that, which is of course good, sometimes it's just impossible. Like, and we also have to accept that things can move, and because now in Paris, if you cut one tree, even if the tree is sick, like you have a protest. And I think, like, you know, at some point, nature is also about transformation, and so, but it's also new ways of negotiating. Like, and sometimes the debate is like, okay, if we want to create, for example, a school, we need to cut 2 trees. So before, like, there was no question, you know, you cut the trees. Now, the trees have more value, but it's very hard to have, I feel, this democratic discussion, like, what's the value, you know, what is more valuable between 2 trees or a school? Nobody knows now, it's very vague, and so there are protests for everything, and so, and Bruno Latour, he wrote a lot about that, how you can also make democracy evolve to include, like, what does it mean, including trees to democracy, like, who represents trees, who talks for them, how do you value them, you know, that are the questions we have now, because we need those discussions, I think.
Hello, thank you for your talk, and he stole one of my questions about what was the city you wanted to take a look, you would choose in particular, but I'll just take that moment just to say that I was living in Melbourne, Australia earlier this year, and when you were talking about animals being integrated to the cities, that's how I felt a lot when I was there. I don't know if this is true, but I heard that it has one of the biggest, like, wild, not parks, but like wild, like sauvage, like, parks. And I used to live literally less than a 60-second walk away, and every single evening, you know, sitting on the hill nearby there, you would watch like thousands of bats, like huge bats, like fly into the city, and kind of like, and you know, if you were in the city, you would see them kind of like land into various trees or whatever, kind of all throughout, and every single night, you know, at sunset, watching them go into the city, you know, kind of imagining all throughout. So that was really interesting, and kind of what I was thinking of when you were doing that, as well as just in like the public parks too. They have possums, but these big possums that like come down from the trees, and you know, you'll just be going through these like not even very large like public parks that are like sort of man-made parks, but kind of like seeing the animals come in. And so that was something that I thought a lot about when you were talking about, and it was just, I could definitely sort of say that it was a great experience, just as like a person walking around, just, you know. And I guess it's a little bit of thinking, like my question involving that would be is, can you kind of clarify or build upon a little bit of what you believe the role is of animals? Like, is it about including nature, and we can test how good that is or not based off of how many animals show up, or do they have their own sort of, you know, can you, yeah, I think maybe you get my question.
Okay, yeah, I heard that about Melbourne, and I've never been, but it seems that it's one of the cities where wild spaces are at the heart. That's also what I read, so yeah, it seems interesting. So about animals, so your question is how
But you mentioned a good bit about how like you were talking about like animals integrating nature to the city, but a lot about animals too, and kind of like figuring out how to like live alongside with more animals. But was it just kind of like we're integrating more nature, so that's something we should expect?
Yeah.
Or when you were talking about having more animals around in the city, is that something that you like? There are more animals, therefore it brings more value. But what is it about having that relationship with animals, or is it that's just going to be a byproduct of this nature we need to integrate? Like, how important are the animals? Is it just a byproduct, or is it in itself valuable?
Yeah, I think both. I mean, since we are bringing more nature, we will have more animals, and among animals, there are always the animals we want and the ones we don't want. You know, that's the first thing. Is also this very vague frontier between desirable animals and non-desirable. So, but you get all the animals. So that's the first thing. And then I think it's a lot a question of power and conflict, as I said just before, because if I think about the dogs in Paris now, there are all those debates and there is this lobby for dogs, and they say that they don't have enough parks where dogs can be free, which is true. But we don't have enough parks for children also. So like, how do you decide? How, like, if you have a small space, because you don't even have, but a new empty space, like, do you give it to kids or to dogs? You know, it's I mean, both have their lobby. You know, so that's really the reality. That's why I was talking about democracy. It's really like, who can decide that? Like how do you map all those needs, and it's true that right now the city is not adapted to animals. Even only talking about domestic animals, like there are not enough spaces, and so I think it's a new imagination about city and spaces and who can access to what. Everything has to be invented, I think, in a way.
Can I do a follow-up on that? As someone working on urban planning here in Chicago, and we've been doing a lot of also ecological plans, so it was great hearing about Paris. One thing about soils is I don't know, maybe you know, there's a movement called DPAVE, and it's in many cities of the United States where we are trying to get soils back to, life, so living soils as infrastructure. So I was wondering, because this is something that I've been personally debating, and I've been on some commissions here in Chicago too. We want more animals, and I'm all for it, and I think maybe rights of nature movement is something that could bring that democratic debate, because it's really about legislative power. Our animals are independent persons in legal rights, right? So that's something that's growing in the world. But also at the same time, we are dealing with a lot of conflicts. So I'm on the river task force, and we're trying to bring urban forests into the riverfront. But at the same time, you have all these glazed buildings, and we have had massive bird strikes in the past 2 days, which was so sad. So how do you reckon that planning in Paris, for example, will resolve some of these tensions? Because as we bring in more nature, we're bringing in also more systems of clash. Because as you said, the cities are not built for this, right? So with a different template and blueprint. And my fear is that as much as we are advocating wilding, greening, and all of that, as human beings, we're not ready to kind of paradigmatically shift our race. So yes, these animals, rivers, everyone has rights. So how do you reckon that you might actually, run into some of these in Paris?
Yeah, I think we are at the same point in a way, meaning that there are different speeds of evolution in what we expect, and we have the same problem with birds, of course. That the way buildings were designed, it was not sold at all for animals, and the first thing is like the facade. Is the facade not like killing birds, and is the facade welcoming for animals? So, because we talked a lot about soils, but in fact architecture is I mean, buildings, also everything has to be made. From now on, what does it mean to have a building that is welcoming for animals? So you have the roof, of course, where you can welcome biodiversity, but also the facade, like how do you create, we call it cavité, so like small unfractuosities or something like that, where animals can go and live, and that's completely new. I mean, when I look at French architecture, those questions were not really taught in architecture schools, so there are not a lot of teachers who know about it, who can share that knowledge. So everything has to be done really. So yeah, I don't know how long it will take, but there are all those technical questions, and then there are all those political questions, as you said, question of priorities, of choices, and of maybe some people are ready to cohabit, some not. So, but yeah.
Thank you for your talk. And when I go across the street from where I live at night, sometimes I run into coyotes. And I think about how we have this hegemony of zoning by use. And the joke amongst me and my colleagues is that the Department of Zoning is where all good ideas go to die. But is there a different way to think about zoning, like by time? The notion that at different times of day or different seasons, something has to change to align itself with the natural world. Have you, like, how do we proceed that way? So for instance, with the birds flying into the glass of my building or the McCormick place, is there a way to kind of codify the notion that these buildings for different seasons or different times of year somehow have to transform themselves so they accommodate nature?
I completely agree with you, and I think that's like the next step. And honestly, that the Parisian urban plan has not gone that far, but I think that the next step is really thinking about different times of the day and of the year, because buildings shouldn't be the same depending on the seasons and all that. I completely agree, and I think that's a new relation to time that has to be invented in urban planning, and that is very contradictory with how regulation is made everywhere. So I don't know how to do, but definitely like things have to be invented in that direction, and that's where you see the limits of regulation, because how laws, how municipal rules are invented are very strict and not adapted to like natural calendars. So, but now in Paris we talk a lot about chronotopia, for example, this idea that you have to adapt spaces depending on time, etc., and that when you design a space you have to think about those different times and not the space being used like 2 hours in a day. Or if you have an office building, how it can be used during weekends, or schoolyards during weekends. So it is coming, but also it's still the beginning, I think. So it's also an imagination shift we have to make.
It's like a reversibility for the city in terms of space and uses.
Yeah.
Okay, we'll take one last question, and then don't worry, we can keep the conversation going next door, but let's, Monsieur.
Here, land is always talked about in terms of its value, like economic value, and there's a kind of extractive mindset. So I wonder if something, forgive my ignorance, but has something changed in Paris where you are able to make decisions based on these ideas independently of land having a perceived economic value? And if so, how can we learn from it?
Yeah. No, I mean, it's not independent from land value, but I think that French urban planning and Parisian urban planning obviously is more regulatory than Anglo-Saxon context, and I think that we have some powerful tools that are, and I mean sometimes like the developers in Paris, they complain a lot about it, but I think our tools that for us to create social housing are very strong. Like right now in the new planning rules, if you transform an office building, you have to integrate housing in it. That's like the new rule. So a lot of people are complaining about it, but it's also saying we don't want to have like areas with only offices. So if you transform, you have to integrate some mixity, and so I think thanks to this regulatory strong framework, we have maybe we have more power when discussing with the private sector than in other contexts. But it's always like you have pros and cons, because then it's less flexible, and sometimes maybe negotiation would be also more efficient than only rules. So I also see the advantages of like the English or US context. But yeah, I think that right now in big cities like Paris or Chicago, like there are, I mean, the economic interests are so strong, and the market alone obviously is not functional. Like for example, when you think about Airbnb, when you think about tourism, about Amazon, like you need strong regulatory framework, because the city cannot be governed like that by the market, obviously. So I think in that context, it's good to have the French tools, and that sometimes it would be useful in other contexts. Yeah.
Well, again, I think we have a lot more interesting questions. It's been a really fabulous exchange. Thank you so much to our guests. Thank you to Marion. Also, thanks to you. I will point out that right outside the door, we will have the books for sale. Andrew Todd's book, The Clearing, and Marion Waller's book, Natural Artifacts. I also want to encourage you to talk to Christian Snellen. Christian, if you're on the way. This is the publisher, the Danish publisher who was with us tonight. It's not only a publishing house, but also doing a lot more in terms of environment. And you know, Denmark is ahead of us, so don't hesitate to exchange with him. The publishing house, I won't even try to pronounce it. I was struggling, but it means the New Bridge Street, okay? New Brogade.
That's very close. That's very good.
So Danish is not my forte. So again, thank you to everybody. Let's keep the conversation going. And again, thank you to Villa Albertine and the Chicago Architecture Biennale for bringing us such interesting guests who give us a completely different. I mean, I fight with ants in my house. I don't want them in, so I have to live with them.